You know that feeling of being completely certain about something until life decides to show you that maybe you don't know as much as you thought. That's exactly what happened to Professor Daniel Moretti that October afternoon. He wasn't just any man, he was a respected intellectual, one of those people who built an entire career on cold logic and well-founded skepticism. For over 20 years, Daniel taught philosophy of science and secular ethics at a university in Milan, always with that stance of someone who accepts nothing without concrete proof. To him, faith was something for people who couldn't deal with reality, a psychological crutch for those afraid of the unknown. The Bible, an interesting historical book, but nothing more. Religion, a cultural phenomenon. Spirituality, a well-crafted illusion. Daniel had answers for everything, and those answers never included God. He lived in a world where everything could be explained by neuroscience, sociology, or simple coincidence, and that gave him tremendous comfort, a sense of control over existence. But life has a curious way of pulling us out of our comfort zone precisely when we think we've figured it all out, doesn't it? In 2023, Daniel was working on a book about modern holiness in the digital age, and Carlo Acutis had become an impossible case to ignore. A kid who died at 15 in 2006, victim of a devastating leukemia, and who somehow managed to mobilize millions of young Christians around the world. The Italian professor was intrigued by all of it. How could an ordinary teenager who liked video games and programming, who wore worn-out sneakers and simple t-shirts, have generated such a huge movement of devotion and testimonies of faith? It didn't make sense to his reasoning. Carlo hadn't performed spectacular miracles in life, hadn't written complex theological treatises, hadn't founded any church or formal religious movement. He was just a kid who went to worship, participated in praise and worship in his community, did his Bible studies, and lived an apparently ordinary Christian life. But there was something there that Daniel needed to understand, even if just to prove it was another case of well-executed religious marketing. That's how he found himself that sunny October afternoon, exactly 17 years after Carlo's death, walking through the streets of Assisi toward the sanctuary where the young man's body rests. Daniel wasn't there out of faith. He made that very clear to himself with every step. It was pure academic curiosity, historical interest, a professional need to understand the sociological phenomenon behind all this devotion. He expected to find crowds, cameras, all that circus that normally accompanies famous pilgrimage sites. But when he arrived, the place was almost empty, just a few elderly visitors saying their prayers in silence, whispering pleas that seemed to echo off the sanctuary's ancient walls. Daniel knelt in front of the tomb, not to pray, but to observe. He took photos of the plaques, jotted down phrases engraved in stone, analyzed the architecture and religious symbols with that clinical gaze of someone studying culture, like dissecting a dead organism. He was in control, doing exactly what he'd always done, turning the sacred into an object of study, maintaining that safe distance between observer and observed. But something was about to happen, something that not all his academic preparation, not all his years of skepticism, not all his confidence in reason could explain or control. The thing is, Daniel had spent his entire adult life building intellectual walls against anything that smelled of transcendence. In his classes, he used to tell his students that prayer was simply a form of self-induced meditation, that sermons were rhetorical techniques to manipulate emotions, and that any spiritual experience could be reduced to neuronal activity in the temporal lobe. He had written papers on how Christianity spread for social and political reasons, never through divine intervention. He analyzed the gospel as literature, church rituals as anthropology, conversion testimonies as mass psychology. Everything had a rational explanation. Everything fit within the categories he handled so skillfully in his lectures. And that certainty, That ability to dismantle any religious argument with relentless logic had given him a formidable reputation in academic circles. He was the man they called when they wanted a secular perspective on religious phenomena, the expert who could explain why people believed without needing to believe himself. But there was something Daniel didn't include in his books, something he kept as an uncomfortable secret. His rejection of religion wasn't purely intellectual. There was a wound there, a crack in the rationalist professor's armor. When he was 18, his younger sister died in a car accident, and his parents, devout Catholics, told him it was God's will that she was in a better place, that they should have faith in the divine plan. Daniel never forgave them for those phrases. To him, they weren't comfort but cowardice, a way to avoid the absurd cruelty of reality. Since then, he had made his atheism into armor, a way to never again feel that powerlessness disguised as hope. Faith, in his mind, was the enemy of truth, and truth, however painful, was the only thing worth trusting. That's why he studied religious phenomena with that mixture of fascination and disdain. He wanted to understand how people could deceive themselves so completely, how they could prefer pretty stories to hard facts. And now, 3 decades later, he was kneeling in front of a dead teenager's tomb, taking notes as if he were at an archaeological dig. The sanctuary smelled of incense and old stone, a combination that vaguely reminded him of the churches of his childhood, before rage and pain drove him away from all that. As he read a plaque talking about Carlo's Eucharistic devotion, about how the boy considered Mass the center of his spiritual life, Daniel felt something strange, not a revelation, but a discomfort. It was as if someone were watching him, not with judgment, but with compassion. He shook his head. Effects of religious architecture on the psyche, he thought, quickly searching for a mental category to place that uncomfortable sensation. But the discomfort didn't disappear. On the contrary, it intensified. And then, when he was about to get up and leave, he felt a presence beside him. A real, physical, undeniable presence. He turned his head, and there he was. A boy about 15 years old. Jeans, sneakers, glasses. A t-shirt with a phrase in Italian about holiness and daily life. He was smiling not politely, but with a joy so natural it was disconcerting, almost disturbing in its authenticity. Daniel froze, not from fear, but from something he couldn't identify. The boy looked at him as if he'd known him his whole life, as if they shared a secret that only Daniel had forgotten. And then he spoke, with a clear, calm voice that seemed to fill the entire sanctuary space. "Professor Moretti, you didn't come here to believe. You came here to understand. But there are things your methods will never be able to measure." Daniel felt his skin crawl. Not because of the words, he'd heard similar arguments 1,000 times from believers trying to defend the indefensible. No, what froze him was that the boy knew his name, his full name. And he had never been to that sanctuary before, had never spoken to anyone there. "Who are you?" Daniel managed to articulate, his voice sounding strangely distant in his own ears. The boy kept smiling, that smile that seemed to contain infinite tenderness mixed with something like humor. "I'm Carlo," he responded with absolute calm, like someone giving their name in an everyday introduction. And some truths don't contradict reason. They complete it. Daniel felt the ground move beneath his feet. This couldn't be happening. Carlo Acutis had been dead for 17 years. His body was right there, in that tomb, a few meters from where they stood. What was this? A hallucination? A trick? Some actor hired by someone who knew about his research. But no, that didn't make sense. No one knew he was coming today. Not even he himself had planned it in advance. It had been an impulse, a last-minute decision while he was in Assisi for another reason. His rational mind began frantically searching for explanations, but each explanation crumbled before fully forming. "This isn't possible," Daniel murmured, more to himself than to the boy. I must be tired, or maybe." But Carlo, if it really was him, if this was really happening, gently shook his head. "You've always believed that everything has a logical explanation, haven't you, Professor? And you're right. Everything does. But God's logic is broader than yours. It doesn't contradict it. It transcends it." He walked a few steps toward a wooden bench and sat down, gesturing for Daniel to do the same. The professor, acting more on autopilot than conscious decision, obeyed. He sat down, and in that moment, something inside him began to break, not violently, but with the gentleness of a crack opening in a wall that had been holding an unbearable weight for too long. Carlo looked him straight in the eyes and said, "You didn't come here for me. You came here for your daughter." And that's when Daniel Moretti's world truly collapsed. Veronica, his 19-year-old daughter. The only topic in his life about which all his logic, all his reason, all his analytical ability was absolutely useless. Veronica had spent 2 years sinking into a deep depression that no psychologist, no psychiatrist, no treatment had managed to alleviate. She had attempted suicide 3 times. The last was just 2 months ago, and since then, she'd been living in a private psychiatric clinic on the outskirts of Milan. Daniel visited her every Sunday, and each visit was silent torture, seeing his brilliant, talented daughter, full of potential, reduced to a shadow who could barely hold a 5-minute conversation without breaking down in tears or sinking into catatonic silence. He had read all the papers on major depression, had consulted the best specialists, had tried all evidence-based therapies. Nothing worked. And the worst, the absolutely unbearable part, was the powerlessness. His whole life, he'd solved problems with intellect, and now he faced one that intellect couldn't touch. How? Daniel couldn't finish the sentence. Carlo continued, his voice soft but firm. "You've tried to save her with reason, because it's the only thing you allowed yourself to believe after losing your sister. But Veronica's pain isn't a problem to solve. It's a void to fill. And you can't fill it, Daniel. No one can, except the one who created her." The professor felt tears burning in his eyes, something that hadn't happened since his sister's funeral 30 years ago. "Don't ask me to believe in a God who allows a 19-year-old girl to want to die," he whispered with a mixture of rage and desperation. "Don't ask me to pray to someone who sat idle while my sister died, while my daughter sinks." Carlo didn't look away. "I'm not asking you to believe. I'm asking you to listen. Veronica needs something you can't give her because you don't have it. She needs hope. Not the hope that everything will turn out well according to your plans or mine, but the hope that there's meaning, purpose, a hand that holds even in the deepest darkness. She's searching for something to fill the void, and she's been searching in all the wrong places. Just like you." Daniel remained silent. A heavy, dense silence, full of decades of certainties crumbling like houses of cards. Carlo stood up, put a hand on the professor's shoulder, and that hand felt completely real, warm, human, and said, "There's a church near the clinic where Veronica is. It's called San Paolo. Go there next Sunday before visiting her. Just go in. Just sit. You don't have to pray. You don't have to believe. Just be willing for something greater than your understanding to enter your life. And tell Veronica she's not alone, that she never has been, that there's someone who loves her more than you, with all your father's love can imagine." And then, without warning, without dramatic farewell, Carlo simply wasn't there anymore. He didn't disappear in a brilliant light or fade like smoke. He simply left. Like when you finish talking to someone on the street and each person goes their own way. Except there was no way to go. The sanctuary was empty. Absolutely empty. Daniel sat on that bench for almost an hour. He didn't think. He didn't analyze. He just was there, feeling how something inside him, something that had been closed and armored for 3 decades slowly, painfully opened, like a flower blooming after too long a winter. For the first time in his adult life, Professor Daniel Moretti, expert in philosophy of science, professional skeptic, convinced atheist, had no explanations. He had no theories. He had no arguments. He only had questions. And a strange, new, almost terrifying sensation. The possibility, just the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was something true in everything he'd spent decades rejecting. It wasn't faith. Not yet. It was something smaller and bigger at the same time. It was a surrender. The surrender of someone who finally accepts that he doesn't know everything, doesn't control everything, that maybe, just maybe, reality is much vaster and more mysterious than his mental categories can encompass. The following Sunday, Daniel Moretti did something he never thought he'd do. He went to church. Not to the San Paulo church that Carlo had mentioned. He wasn't ready for that yet. He went to a small chapel near his apartment in Milan, one of those places he'd passed 1,000 times without paying attention. It was early in the morning, and the chapel was empty except for an elderly woman praying the rosary in a corner. Daniel entered, sat in the last pew, and simply stayed there. He didn't pray. He didn't know how. But for the first time in 30 years, he didn't actively reject the idea that there might be someone listening. He sat there for 40 minutes, wrapped in a silence that was different from any silence he'd experienced before. It wasn't the empty silence of a study room or the uncomfortable silence of a dead conversation. It was a silence, full, as if someone were there with him, saying nothing, simply accompanying him in his confusion and pain. When he left, he didn't feel he'd found answers, but he felt something more valuable. He felt that maybe it was okay not to have them. That afternoon, during his weekly visit to Veronica, Daniel did something he also hadn't planned. He told her what had happened in Assisi. Everything. The encounter with Carlo, the words about her, the sensation of being before something that escaped all rational explanation. He expected Veronica to think he'd gone crazy, that his daughter, who had inherited his skepticism and love of logic, would laugh or worry about his mental health. But that's not what happened. Veronica looked at him with an intensity he hadn't seen in her eyes for months and whispered, "Dad, I've also been feeling something calling me. I don't know what it is, but it's like there's a door that's always been there, and I'd never seen it until now." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He took his daughter's hand, cold, fragile, small, and told her something he never thought he'd say. "What if we open it together? I don't know what's on the other side. I don't know if I'm going to believe everything they tell me I should believe. But what if we try?" And so began a journey that neither of them had chosen, but which, mysteriously, seemed to have been waiting for them all along. Daniel started attending Mass with Veronica first in the clinic's chapel, then at San Paulo, the church Carlo had mentioned. At first, he felt ridiculous, like an imposter among genuine believers. He didn't understand the rituals, the automatic responses everyone seemed to know by heart, the gestures of the liturgy. But little by little, something started to change. It wasn't a spectacular change. There wasn't a dramatic conversion moment where light descended and all his doubts evaporated. It was more subtle, more gradual. It was like learning a new language at first. The words don't make sense, the sounds seem random, but with time, you start to catch patterns, meanings, an internal logic that was previously invisible. Daniel started reading the gospel, not as literature, but searching for something more. He started paying attention to sermons, not with his critic's mind, but with something like openness. And slowly, almost without realizing it, he started to pray. Clumsily at first, not really knowing what to say or how to say it. But he prayed. The most extraordinary thing was seeing how Veronica started to change. Not overnight. Depression doesn't work that way, and the path of healing is long and full of setbacks. But there was something different about her. A spark that had been extinguished was starting to light up again. She began participating in prayer groups for young people at San Paulo, making friends with other young Christians who, like her, struggled with their own demons, but found strength in shared faith. She started reading faith testimonies from other people who had gone through depression, anxiety, suicide attempts, and who had found in Christian spirituality not a magical cure, but an anchor, meaning a reason to keep going when logic suggested giving up. Daniel would see her participate in praise and worship during services with an intensity that moved him to tears. He'd see her taking notes during Bible studies with the same intellectual fervor she once applied to her university studies. And one day, 3 months after that encounter in Assisi, Veronica left the clinic. Not because she was cured. She herself said she'd probably have to deal with depression the rest of her life. But because she had found reasons to live stronger than her reasons to die. The impact of all this on Daniel's professional life was, as expected, complicated. He couldn't simply announce in an academic paper that he'd had a mystical encounter with a dead saint and now believed in God. His colleagues would have considered him crazy, or worse yet, intellectually dishonest. So he kept quiet about the specific details. But his research approach changed subtly. He began studying religious phenomena not from the outside, with clinical distance, but from within, with what academics call participant observation, but which, in his case, was something much deeper. He started attending spiritual retreats, interviewing not just theologians but ordinary people who lived their faith day to day. He started reading devotional texts, not to analyze them, but to understand them. And he discovered something fascinating, that there was logic in faith, but it wasn't the Aristotelian logic he'd studied his whole life. It was a logic of the heart, as Pascal would say, no less rigorous, but operating on a different level of reality. His book about modern holiness in the digital age took a completely unexpected turn. What was going to be a cold analysis of sociological phenomena became something more like a meditation on the possibility of the transcendent in a secularized world. He dedicated an entire chapter to Carlo Acutis, but he didn't want to tell his own experience. Instead, he explored how Carlo's life, apparently so ordinary, so full of everyday things like video games and hamburgers and catechism classes, could at the same time be radically extraordinary. How a boy who never wrote a book, or founded a movement, or performed spectacular miracles in life could, after his death, touch millions of lives and challenge the most ingrained skepticism. Daniel interviewed dozens of people who had been impacted by Carlo, from young people who had returned to church after discovering his story to parents who had found comfort in his example when facing the death of their own children. And in each testimony, in each story, Daniel saw reflected something of his own experience, the shock of encountering something that reason cannot explain, but that the heart recognizes as true. There were difficult moments, of course. Nights of doubt where Daniel wondered if it had all been a hallucination, a trick of his exhausted mind desperate to find a solution to his daughter's suffering. Moments where his old skeptical self rebelled against the beliefs he was beginning to adopt, screaming that it was all irrational, that he was betraying decades of intellectual rigor, that he had become exactly the type of person he used to despise someone who prefers pretty stories to hard truths. But then, he'd remember Carlo's hand on his shoulder, as real as anything he'd ever touched in his life. He'd remember how Carlo knew about Veronica, something no one could know. He'd remember the change in his daughter, slow but undeniable, like a plant growing back after a frost. And he'd think, even if it had all been a product of my imagination, even if there was a perfect neurological explanation for what I experienced, would that make the fruit it has produced less real? Would it make less true the fact that both Veronica and I have found something we desperately needed? Daniel began participating more actively in the life of San Paulo Parish. First just attending Mass with Veronica, then joining Bible study groups, which he found ironic, given that he had taught about religious texts for years, but had never read them seeking personal guidance. He discovered that the Bible, when read not as a historical document, but as living word, reveals layers of meaning that his academic analysis had never touched. Jesus Christ's parables, which before seemed like simple moral metaphors, now resonated with a depth that surprised him. Paul's letters, which he previously analyzed as first-century rhetoric, he now reads seeking practical wisdom for his daily life. And the Psalms, especially the Psalms of Lament, where the author cries out to God from the deepest desperation, he'd read them and think of Veronica, of his sister who died so long ago, of all who suffer without apparent comfort. And he found in them not easy answers, but perhaps something more valuable: companionship in suffering, the sense that human pain isn't something to hide or rationalize, but something that can be brought before God in all its rawness. One day, almost 6 months after the encounter in Assisi, Daniel was teaching a class on philosophy of religion when a student asked him directly, "Professor, do you believe in God?" It was a question he'd been asked hundreds of times throughout his career, and he'd always responded with a clear, well-argued negative. But this time he stopped. He looked at his 30 students watching him expectantly, waiting for the answer from the famous skeptic, the man who could dismantle any theistic argument with logical elegance. And Daniel responded, "I don't know if I can prove God's existence with the methods I use to prove other things. But I can say this: I've experienced something that escapes my usual categories of explanation. And that experience has produced good fruit in my life and in the life of someone I love. That's not proof in the scientific sense. But perhaps there are forms of knowledge that don't depend solely on scientific proof. Perhaps there are truths that are known by living, not just thinking." There was silence in the classroom. Some students seemed confused, others intrigued. And Daniel knew that something fundamental had changed. He was no longer the professor who had all the answers, but the one who had learned to live with the questions. What Daniel found hardest was prayer. Going to Mass didn't bother him. There was something in the liturgy, in its ancient and repetitive structure, that calmed him. Reading religious texts didn't bother him. He was still an academic at heart and enjoyed studying theology and scriptures. But personal prayer, that intimate dialogue with an invisible God, was deeply uncomfortable. He felt ridiculous talking to himself in his room, addressing a being he couldn't see or hear or touch. His rational mind mocked him. "Do you really believe there's someone listening?" But he kept trying, clumsily, sometimes just saying, "I don't know how to do this," out loud, and letting silence envelop him. Over time, he learned that perhaps prayer wasn't so much about talking as listening. Not hearing voice is nothing so dramatic, but listening to that small voice inside him that knew things his reason didn't know, that saw connections his logic didn't see, that offered a different kind of wisdom than books could teach. Veronica, for her part, had become a kind of spiritual guide for her father, which they both found deeply ironic. She taught him contemporary praise songs, took him to Christian youth events where Daniel was invariably the oldest person by several decades, recommended sermon podcasts and YouTube channels about Bible studies. Daniel sometimes felt like a freshman learning the basics while his daughter was already in advanced courses. But there was beauty in that, in being vulnerable, in being the one who doesn't know, in learning from someone, he'd spent his whole life teaching. Veronica told him that when she was in the depths of her depression, what tormented her most was the feeling of absolute emptiness, the idea that life had no purpose or meaning beyond what we invent to console ourselves. It was like living in a universe completely indifferent to my existence, she told him, and that was unbearable. But when I started exploring faith, when I started considering the possibility that maybe there is meaning, purpose, someone who knows and loves me, it wasn't that the depression magically disappeared, but I wasn't alone in it anymore. Daniel began noticing subtle changes in how he saw the world. Things that before seemed like mere coincidences now he saw as not necessarily miracles, but as moments charged with meaning. A text message that arrived just when he needed it most. A Bible passage that seemed to speak directly to his situation. A chance encounter with an old friend who somehow brought the conversation exactly to the topic Daniel had been ruminating on in prayer. He couldn't prove these things were divine intervention. His academic mind still searched for probabilistic explanations. But he had learned to hold both perspectives simultaneously, the rational explanation and the spiritual interpretation, without needing one to cancel the other. Perhaps, he thought, reality was rich enough to sustain multiple levels of truth simultaneously. Perhaps the error of his previous atheism wasn't that it was wrong about the facts, but that it was incomplete. He saw one layer of reality, but insisted it was the only one. There was a particularly powerful moment about 8 months after that encounter in Assisi. Daniel and Veronica decided to make a pilgrimage together back to the sanctuary where it all began. This time, the place was full of people. It was a special day of commemoration. Daniel knelt in the same spot where he'd knelt that October afternoon, and this time he did pray. Not an elaborate prayer, not theologically precise words. Just, thank you. I don't understand all of this. I probably never will completely. But thank you for not giving up on me, for reaching me even when I wasn't looking for you, for using even my skepticism as a path to you. And as he prayed, he felt that same presence he'd felt the first time, not visible, not audible, but undeniable. A presence that said without words, I know you. I've always known you, and I've never let you go, not even when you let go of me. Daniel cried. Not tears of sadness, but of something he could only describe as relief, the relief of someone who's been carrying an impossible weight for decades and finally allows himself to let it fall. Veronica, standing beside him, put her hand on his shoulder, the same gesture Carlo had made months before. And Daniel understood something, that healing doesn't come from understanding everything, from having all the answers, from being able to explain every mystery. It comes from trusting, from opening up, from allowing something greater than ourselves to enter our life and transform it in ways we could never have planned or predicted. His journey from convinced atheist to tentative believer hadn't ended. It probably never would completely. He'd always have questions. There would always be parts of Christian doctrine that his logical mind found difficult to accept. But he had learned that faith isn't the absence of doubt, but the decision to trust despite doubt. It's saying yes to a mystery that calls you, even when you can't see the whole path ahead. It's choosing hope over despair, openness over cynicism, love over fear. And that, Daniel thought as he rose from his prayer, wasn't betraying reason. It was recognizing its limits and daring to explore what lies beyond. The book Daniel finally published, titled Beyond Method, Encounters with the Inexplicable in the Age of Skepticism, caused quite a stir in academic circles. Some colleagues accused him of having lost his intellectual rigor, of having let himself be seduced by magical thinking. Others, however, contacted him privately to say that they too had had experiences they couldn't explain, doubts about their own skepticism, questions their methodologies couldn't answer. A physics professor wrote him, I've spent my entire career studying the laws that govern the universe, and those laws are beautiful, elegant, astonishingly precise. But every time I go deeper, every time we discover something new about quantum reality or cosmology, I find myself not with final answers, but with more mystery. And that mystery doesn't scare me. It calls me. It makes me think that maybe science and faith aren't enemies but different paths to the same fundamental truth. Daniel framed that letter and put it in his office, a reminder that he wasn't alone on this strange and unexpected journey. Daniel also began giving talks at churches, something he never would have imagined doing. Not as an evangelist, he still felt too new in faith for that, but as someone who could build bridges between the world of academic skepticism and the world of religious belief. He spoke with other skeptics, with curious atheists, with people who wanted to believe but felt they had to abandon their intellect to do so. He told them, "You don't have to stop asking questions. You don't have to turn off your critical mind, but consider the possibility that there are forms of knowledge that go beyond the scientific method without contradicting it. Consider that maybe reality is vast enough to include both the measurable and the immeasurable, both the explainable and the mystery." And he saw in his audience's faces the same conflict he had experienced, the longing to believe fighting with the fear of being deceived, hope fighting with skepticism. And he told them, without going into specific details that might sound too fantastic, about his own journey from atheist certainty to spiritual openness. One of the most surprising things about this whole process was how it affected Daniel's relationship with his parents. They were still alive, octogenarians now, and had suffered in silence for decades watching their son reject the faith that for them was the center of their lives. When Daniel told them he'd started attending Mass, that he was exploring Christianity, his mother cried with joy. But Daniel had to set boundaries. "I didn't return to faith to make you happy. And my faith will probably never be exactly like yours. I still have questions. I still struggle with parts of doctrine. But I can say that I understand now why it was so important to you. And I no longer see your faith as weakness or escapism. I see that maybe you are seeing something I refused to see." His father, a man of few words, simply hugged him and said, "We've been praying for this for 30 years. We knew God hadn't forgotten you." And Daniel, instead of feeling anger or resentment, felt gratitude. Gratitude because someone had kept the door open even when he insisted on keeping it closed. Veronica gradually recovered, though as she said, recovery didn't mean going back to who she was before depression, but becoming someone new who had integrated both suffering and hope. She began studying theology at university, with the intention of someday working with young people struggling with mental health issues. "I want to be for others what the San Paulo community was for me," she told Daniel. "I want other young people to know they don't have to choose between being intellectually honest and being spiritually open, that they can have faith without stopping asking questions. That doubt isn't faith's enemy, but sometimes its necessary companion." Daniel listened to her and marveled at how his daughter, who had been so close to death, was now so full of life and purpose. It wasn't that all her problems had disappeared. She still had difficult days, still took medication, still went to therapy. But something fundamental had changed. There was hope where before there was only emptiness. And Carlo Acutis, the young saint who had started all this, continued to be a constant presence in their lives. Daniel and Veronica began a tradition of visiting his tomb every year on the anniversary of that first encounter. They brought flowers, prayed, sometimes just sat in silence. Daniel never saw Carlo again the way he saw him that first afternoon. There were no more apparitions, no more impossible conversations. But he didn't need them. That one encounter had been enough to open a door that had been closed his whole life. And now, every time he passed through that door, every time he prayed, every time he went to Mass, every time he chose to trust instead of control, he felt that Carlo was there somehow, smiling with that natural joy, saying without words, "See, I told you some truth's complete reason," instead of contradicting it. Daniel had dedicated his book to Carlo Acutis, who taught me that the deepest skepticism isn't rejecting what we don't understand, but having the courage to explore it. 3 years after that encounter that changed everything, Daniel Moretti is sitting in his university office preparing a class on philosophy of religion. On his desk, there's a Bible next to his academic texts, something that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. On the wall, there's a photo of Veronica at her graduation, radiant and alive. And there's also a small image of Carlo Acutis, the saint in jeans and sneakers, the patron of the internet, the teenager who died at 15, but who somehow keeps changing lives decades later. Daniel looks at that image and thinks about how his entire life turned in a completely unexpected direction because of an encounter that lasted maybe 20 minutes. And he wonders how many other people are out there, skeptical like he was, sure that God doesn't exist or that faith is for the weak, not realizing that maybe they're just one moment, just one encounter, just one experience away from discovering that reality is much more mysterious and amazing than they ever imagined. And that question leads him to another. What would he say now to his self from 3 years ago, to the professor convinced that everything could be explained, that miracles were impossible, that faith was incompatible with reason? He leans back in his chair, looks out the window at Milan's streets where everyday life continues in its familiar rhythm, and smiles. He'd tell him, "Daniel, your whole life you've searched for truth. You've been rigorous, honest, relentless in your search. But you've only been searching in certain places, using only certain tools. What if truth were bigger than your method? What if there were dimensions of reality that your science can't touch, but that aren't any less real? I'm not asking you to abandon your intellectual rigor. I'm asking you to expand it, to consider that maybe reason and faith aren't enemies but allies, two different ways of approaching the same fundamental mystery." And then he'd add with a smile, "And Daniel, get ready, because God has an incredible sense of humor. He's going to reach you exactly where you least expect it, using exactly the means you'd least anticipate. And when he does, your whole life is going to change." But the deepest truth Daniel has learned in these 3 years isn't theological or philosophical. It's much simpler and much more difficult. The truth that sometimes we have to lose ourselves to find ourselves, that sometimes we have to let go of control to receive what we really need, that sometimes the greatest wisdom is admitting we don't know everything. For decades, Daniel had lived with the illusion of control, the idea that if he studied enough, if he thought enough, if he applied the right method, he could understand and solve any problem. Veronica's depression shattered that illusion, and the encounter with Carlo showed him there was another way to live, not in absolute certainty, but in trust, not in control, but in surrender, not in having all the answers, but in being open to mystery. It's a more humble way to live, but also more free. He no longer has to carry the weight of explaining everything, solving everything, being right about everything. He can simply be a father who loves his daughter, be a seeker who's still learning, be a believer who still doubts, be a human being navigating a universe much vaster and stranger than any theory can encompass.